In many cases, democracy seems to have done little for women per se. Unfortunately, we have learned all too well that states do not adopt feminist agendas on their own. This is, yes, there have been cases of what we call state feminisms, but feminist agendas that respond to the demands from the grassroots is more of a consequence of struggles than something that we can take for granted. So gendered outcomes of democratic transition, whether in Latin America and the Middle East, of course, we will still be observing, but other places such as Eastern Europe, and we heard a lot during the past few days about what's happening there, and other parts of the world has been varied. In some places there have been more success, in others less so. Of course, one of the problems with democracy analysis or approaches to democracy is that we tend to get entangled with electoral processes. And from that perspective, democracy has been very resilient in all the countries that I have referred to. Electoral processes are working. But competitive elections, competitive electoral systems really mask over other essential components of democracy that we often overlook. I will not get into the details of this. There has been much analysis on these. But the analysis shows that in Latin America, for example, which has had considerable now years of experience in this regard, there is a great variety in the way this process has taken place. There is consensus in the literature that Chile, Uruguay, Costa Rica, with recent entry of Brazil and Mexico, having been more successful in terms of establishing democratic institutions, inclusive institutions, but others not so much. My own particular experience in this region goes to my work as Special Rapporteur of Violence Against Women, and in that context I looked at El Salvador and Guatemala, two countries that came out of very detrimental civil wars with very different gendered outcomes as well as other forms of outcomes. And I relied on my own work for these two countries as well as others, four-level theoretical perspective in determining the gendered outcomes. And I think this kind of a four-tier analysis in modified forms other analysts have used. So it's not something that I have innovated out of the clear blue sky. But the four concepts that I find very useful in understanding gendered outcomes. One, nature of gender order prior, during, and after transition or conflict. Two, cause or nature of conflict or transition. Three, the international dynamics. To what extent the international world is supportive of what is happening in the individual countries. And four, the position of oppositional groups in the negotiations for a new order. Are the oppositional groups pushed aside and again replaced by a democratic but authoritarian system, or do oppositional groups have considerable bargaining power at the table? Looking at it from this perspective, I found that while Guatemala underwent a far more successful peace process, women were totally in the peace negotiations, were present, and there were very progressive elements that went into the agreements, but in practice, all of this went astray because you had a very dispersed, divided opposition. Women were not organized as a force to negotiate their terms, etc., etc. Whereas in Guatemala, in El Salvador, women used the transition process more effectively, although, of course, they're still ailing in terms of their rights and freedoms today. So I shall say no more because I want to turn the floor over to our speakers. And I would like to have each speaker very briefly introduce themselves before their interventions. Lina, may I start with you, please? And since I took most of the time, I will give you each 8 minutes.
Again, good morning and thank you for being with us. I'm Lina Habib from Lebanon. I'm the Executive Director of the Collective for Research and Training of Development Action, the partner of the Women Learning Partnership in Lebanon. And I will be speaking to the title of this workshop, Perspectives from the Arab Region on Democratic Transitions and Inclusion of Women. In exactly 8 minutes. Before doing so, I wanted just to clarify and highlight where do these perspectives come from. And within the Women Learning Partnership, it's a really privileged framework to be in a laboratory of ideas and practices. And I do not take I do take ownership, but I do not take full credit of these perspectives because they do come from our discussions as partners, and they do come also from a process of starting early on, after a brief period of euphoria, of actually raising concerns and initiating discussions on what is happening to women, what is happening to the women's movement, and what is likely to happen as a result of these transitions. I'm just going to make a few points, which, as I said, is the collective outcome of our discussions over the past few years, in no particular order of priority or importance. Perhaps the first point, again, from which is quite worrisome from a feminist perspective, is that this new myth that history started now, that everything started from tabula rasa, and that there were no other struggles before, particularly no feminist struggle in the Arab region, or no successful feminist struggle with the region. That is a complete and utter fallacy. I do not need to recall the feminist struggles of our Palestinian sisters. The wonderful and daring example of the feminists of the women mock parliament in Palestine, all the gains that the women's movement made in Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, etc. Individual women who have framed the feminist struggles and successes in this region. Our late colleague, I want to recall, for instance, something that we do not remember nowadays. Our friend Amal Basha from Yemen, the first to remove the veil, the only woman of 3 not to refuse to wear the veil in Yemen. Our late and departed Raoufa Hassan, who actually framed a feminist discourse in a country like Yemen, etc., etc. If what we hear is true, if history started now, if repression started now, and if the social movement against repression started now, then why else did we have over these decades prisons and prisoners of conscience and oppression? What was all the repression about if history was made today? Why? The question is, why do we insist on ignoring the past? And this is reminiscent, and I'll end this point with this. This is reminiscent, for instance, with the coming to force of Ben Ali, who insisted that nothing happened before him, that Bourguiba was not a mover and shaker in framing the rights of women in that country. The second point, which actually I want to credit really our colleagues from North Africa, our feminist colleagues from North Africa, for framing it, is this new, again, this new fallacy and this new discourse of the elites versus the masses, of new groups in power, conservative groups in power, presenting themselves as speakers for the people, speakers for the masses, whereas the feminists and the seculars are actually this small elite westernized group who do not really represent the interest and the aspirations of the people. The third point is actually, and I think Yakin has alluded to, is a post-Arab Spring that is really a war on women rather than anything else. I will just recall a few examples. In a country like Tunisia, despite the dictatorship, which was the beacon of the rights of women in the region, the scandalous mention of complementarity in the new constitution, a concept unheard of to be included in the constitution, a total attack on the dignity of women, to frame them as something that complements the man as a male citizen, was actually quite shocking. The introduction of female genital mutilation in Tunisia, the recent incidents of increasing incidents of harassment, rape, women being raped, and then accused of being indecent. If that is not a war on women, then maybe we should look at what is happening in Egypt, parliamentary discussions on necrophilia, marriages of little girls, sexual harassment being a fact of life, the marriage of the forced marriage of little girls in displaced girls from Syria. I can go on forever, but I think every single day we are faced with tangible, concrete examples that can only indicate that the post-Arab Spring is a war on women. Subsequently, this is actually, my fourth point is that this is actually a war on past gains made by women in this region, and the coming out of the syndrome of what we're starting to call the Susie's Law syndrome, which the Egyptian, the new regime in Egypt has creatively introduced, and that is defining every single gain made for women during the past decade as being something that can only be attributed to the First Lady, and then again consistently with I think the conscious attempt to erase the history of the feminist movement, basically ignoring the struggles of the feminists for the reform of the family law, etc. That is actually, we see this as a deliberate attempt to not only ignore past gains, but actually go further back. And this leads us to a situation now, which is my fifth point, a convention that we all fought so hard for that is now in jeopardy, and that's CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Already as a feminist movement, we were struggling for lifting the reservations on that convention. Now I think our current struggle is for keeping this convention relevant at a time when new regimes are actually already starting to express their position vis-à-vis the non-relevance of this convention. My last point is, in terms of perspective, is on diversity being under threat. Diversity, whether religious diversity, ethnic diversity, sexual diversity, all forms of diversity in this region. We are actually, despite all the promises, despite the general statement on participation of youth and youth speaking out and freedom of whatever, I think freedom of belief or non-belief is under threat. Women's freedom over their own body and their agency is not just under threat, it's actually being attacked. Sexual rights is also a non-issue in this day and age, and certainly the rights of various forms of minority. My last point before I conclude is in terms of a general perspective from that region, whether for countries which have gone through the violent forms of transitions or those who are going through more subtle forms of transition, is a situation of religion in power and the whole future which actually exhibits the power of religion over people. thus far, if we look and analyze the discourses of the new power, we're not hearing anything about social policies or economic policies or job creation policies or the ways in which wealth will be, heaven forbid, redistributed, or the ways in which rapid liberal economic policies will be curbed, or the ways in which social institutions will be rebuilt, etc., etc. At least to, if we look at that general discourse, there's nothing clear or concrete or apparent about this. It is as if this new era is all about the ways in which religion is going to control women. Absolutely. So just to conclude. And I'm sorry if this is alarmist, but I think that is the reading of many of us on this situation. But I will conclude with action and strategy. When it comes to the position of women, when it comes to the rights of women, when it comes to the participation of women, I think what we're looking at now is a farce of a democracy. I think anybody who knows half the story of what is happening to women in the region will conclude that it would be indeed